Ever heard of an HOA that demolished a disabled boy's wheelchair ramp? Get ready for a story of outrageous injustice, and even more outrageous karma. But before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. You do not want to miss how this one unfolds. The crisp, white envelope, stark against the cheerful yellow paint of their mailbox, arrived with the Tuesday afternoon mail. Barbara Miller, a woman whose life had taught her to anticipate the worst, recognized the embossed logo of the Creekside Manor Homeowners Association instantly. A knot of apprehension, cold and tight, formed in her stomach. Her 10-year-old son Timmy sat in his wheelchair beside her on the porch, his bright, inquisitive eyes fixed on the envelope. He'd been using his wheelchair ever since the accident 3 years ago, a drunk driver plowing into their minivan on a rainy night, stealing Timmy's ability to walk and Barbara's sense of security in one horrifying instant. Barbara carefully slit open the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, the formal letterhead of the HOA seemed to mock her with its pristine formality. The words swam before her eyes, but the core message was brutally clear. The newly constructed wheelchair ramp leading to their front door was in violation of the association's bylaws. Specifically, it cited Article 4, Section 7, Paragraph B, "No exterior modifications that alter the aesthetic uniformity of the community are permitted without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." The ramp, built just 2 weeks prior by her brother, Jake, a skilled carpenter with a heart of gold, was deemed an unapproved modification and an aesthetic detriment. Barbara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This ramp wasn't a cosmetic choice, it was essential for Timmy's independence. It allowed him to come and go from the house without relying on her to carry him, a growing burden as he got older and heavier. It was his lifeline to the outside world, his connection to friends, to school, to a semblance of normalcy. The letter demanded the ramp's removal within 10 days, threatening fines and further legal action if she failed to comply. Barbara immediately called the HOA office, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She was put through to a curt secretary who informed her that Mr. Harold Peterson, the HOA president, was unavailable. Barbara left a desperate message pleading for him to call her back. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, unanswered emails, and increasingly desperate pleas. Barbara contacted the city's disability services, hoping for some kind of intervention, but they informed her that HOAs often had considerable autonomy in enforcing their own regulations. She even reached out to a local lawyer who, after reviewing the HOA bylaws, offered little hope of a quick or easy solution. Mr. Peterson finally returned her call on the 5th day, his voice cold and unyielding. He was a man in his late 60s, with a reputation for being a stickler for rules, a man who seemed to derive a peculiar satisfaction from enforcing the minutiae of the HOA regulations. He lived 3 houses down from Barbara and Timmy, and she'd often seen him scrutinizing his neighbors' lawns for any sign of imperfection. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his tone laced with condescension, "the rules are quite clear. The ramp is a violation. It detracts from the overall aesthetic harmony of Creekside Manor." Barbara tried to reason with him, explaining Timmy's situation, his needs, the crucial role the ramp played in his life. "Mr. Peterson," she pleaded, "my son is in a wheelchair. He needs this ramp to get in and out of the house. It's not about aesthetics, it's about his basic human dignity." Peterson remained unmoved. "I understand your situation, Mrs. Miller," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but rules are rules. We have to maintain property values. And frankly, the ramp is quite unsightly. It simply doesn't fit in with the character of our community." Barbara felt a surge of fury. "Property values?" she retorted. "My son's ability to live a normal life is more important than your precious property values." The conversation escalated, ending with Peterson hanging up on her after reiterating the deadline and the consequences of noncompliance. Barbara was left feeling utterly defeated, the weight of the situation crushing her. She explained the situation to Timmy as gently as she could, but the fear in his eyes mirrored her own. The day of the deadline arrived with a grim finality. Barbara had spent the previous night unable to sleep, tossing and turning, replaying the conversations with Peterson in her head, searching for any possible solution. But there was none. Early that morning, a truck bearing the logo of a local demolition company pulled up in front of their house. 2 burly men, accompanied by Mr. Peterson himself, his face set in a smug expression of self-satisfaction, emerged from the vehicle. Timmy, watching from the living room window, began to cry. Barbara rushed to his side, holding him close, trying to shield him from the sight and sound of the impending destruction. The workers, under Peterson's watchful gaze, set about their task with ruthless efficiency. The sound of power tools tearing into it echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Barbara watched, numb with disbelief, as the ramp, her brother's labor of love, was reduced to a pile of rubble. Each splintered board, each twisted piece of metal felt like a physical blow. Peterson, seemingly oblivious to the emotional devastation he was causing, stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a faint smile playing on his lips. He looked like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. When the demolition was complete, he approached Barbara, handing her a copy of the final notice, detailing the fines she now owed. "I trust this will be a lesson learned, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We must all abide by the rules." Barbara didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and burning rage. As Peterson turned and walked away, she clutched Timmy tighter, whispering promises of retribution, promises of a justice that felt impossibly distant at that moment. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and the bitter taste of defeat. But beneath the surface of her despair, a seed of defiance had been planted. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She would fight back. She had to. For Timmy. For herself. For the principle of it all. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. The injustice of it all fueled a fire within her, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. She would make Harold Peterson regret this day. She swore it. The demolition of Timmy's ramp sent ripples of shock and outrage through Creekside Manor, though not everyone was openly sympathetic. While many neighbors had been indifferent to the ramp's presence, or even mildly annoyed by its perceived unsightliness, the sheer callousness of its removal, especially given Timmy's disability, struck a nerve. Whispers of "Peterson's gone too far this time," and "that poor boy," circulated in the grocery store aisles, at the community pool, and during dog walks. A small group of residents, led by Sarah Jenkins, a retired teacher who lived across the street from Barbara and Timmy, decided to take action. Sarah had always been fond of Timmy, often bringing him homemade cookies and chatting with him about his favorite video games. She was appalled by Peterson's heartlessness and couldn't stand idly by. Sarah, along with a few other concerned neighbors, Maria Rodriguez, a young mother with a son Timmy's age, David Chin, a software engineer who valued fairness and justice, and old Mr. Abernathy, a retired lawyer who, despite his age, still possessed a sharp mind and a fiery spirit, gathered at Sarah's house to discuss what could be done. "We can't let Peterson get away with this," Sarah declared, her voice trembling with indignation. "It's not just about the ramp, it's about basic human decency. It's about standing up for what's right." Mr. Abernathy, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief, suggested they start by researching the HOA bylaws themselves. "Peterson is a stickler for the rules," he said, "but he's also arrogant. He might have overlooked something, a loophole, a technicality. We need to find it." The group spent hours poring over the thick, dense document, filled with legal jargon and convoluted clauses. Maria, who had a background in paralegal work, proved invaluable in deciphering the complex language. David, with his analytical mind, created a spreadsheet to track all the relevant articles and sections. Meanwhile, Barbara, still reeling from the emotional blow of the ramp's demolition, found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Flowers and cards arrived on her doorstep. Neighbors offered to help with groceries and errands. A local news crew, alerted by Sarah, showed up to interview her and Timmy. The story of the heartless HOA and the disabled boy who lost his access to freedom quickly gained traction online, spreading like wildfire across social media. Donations began pouring in through a GoFundMe page Sarah had set up to help Barbara rebuild the ramp. The initial goal was modest, but the response was overwhelming. People from all over the country, touched by Timmy's story and angered by Peterson's cruelty, contributed what they could. The fund quickly surpassed its initial target, reaching tens of thousands of dollars within days. As the community rallied around Barbara and Timmy, Mr. Abernathy, after days of meticulous research, finally found what he was looking for. It was a small, almost insignificant clause buried deep within the HOA's bylaws, Article 12, Section 3, Paragraph C, Emergency exceptions to architectural guidelines may be granted by a majority vote of the HOA board in cases of demonstrable hardship or medical necessity. The clause was vague, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The key was to get the HOA board to hold a vote and to convince a majority of the members to side with Barbara and Timmy. This would be a challenge, as Peterson had carefully cultivated a board filled with his loyal supporters, people who rarely questioned his authority. However, the groundswell of public support, fueled by the media attention and the online fundraising campaign, was starting to make some board members nervous. They began to realize that their association's reputation was taking a serious hit, and that siding with Peterson against a disabled child might not be the best long-term strategy. The first crack in Peterson's armor appeared when two board members, Susan Miller, no relation to Barbara, and John Davies, publicly expressed their concerns about the situation. They were uncomfortable with the negative publicity and worried about the potential legal ramifications of denying Timmy access to his home. They were also genuinely moved by Timmy's plight. Sarah, sensing an opportunity, organized a meeting with Susan and John, bringing along Barbara and Timmy. The meeting was emotionally charged. Timmy, usually shy and reserved, spoke eloquently about how much the ramp meant to him, how it allowed him to feel like a normal kid. His words, simple but heartfelt, resonated deeply with Susan and John. By the end of the meeting, Susan and John had agreed to call for an emergency board meeting to discuss the ramp situation. They also promised to lobby their fellow board members to support a vote in favor of reinstating the ramp. The tide was starting to turn. A seed of hope, fragile but real, had been planted in the barren soil of despair. Barbara, for the first time since the demolition, felt a flicker of optimism. The fight was far from over, but she was no longer alone. She had an army of supporters behind her, and a newfound determination to see justice done. The community's response had shown her that even in the face of cruelty and indifference, compassion and empathy could prevail. And that, she realized, was a powerful weapon indeed. The battle lines were drawn, and the upcoming HOA board meeting promised to be a showdown of epic proportions. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the Creekside Manor Community Center, a bland, beige building that usually hosted bingo nights and potlucks. This time, however, it was the setting for a dramatic confrontation, a clash between compassion and callousness, between a community's outrage and one man's stubborn adherence to the rules. The room was packed. Residents, many wearing Ramps for Timmy t-shirts that Sarah had hastily printed, filled every available seat and lined the walls. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Barbara and Timmy sat in the front row, flanked by Sarah, Mr. Abernathy, Maria, and David. They looked determined but also apprehensive. The outcome of this meeting would determine not only Timmy's access to his home but also the future of the Creekside Manor community. Harold Peterson, looking pale and flustered, sat at the head table with the other board members. He avoided eye contact with Barbara and Timmy, his usual air of self-assuredness noticeably absent. He'd clearly underestimated the backlash his actions would provoke. The negative publicity, the online outrage, the sheer volume of angry emails and phone calls had taken him by surprise. He'd even received a few veiled threats, which had rattled him more than he cared to admit. The meeting began with Peterson attempting to regain control, banging his gavel and calling for order. He launched into a rambling defense of his actions, reiterating the importance of maintaining property values and upholding the HOA bylaws. He painted himself as a victim, a misunderstood enforcer of the rules, unfairly targeted by a mob of emotional and irrational residents. His words, however, fell flat. The audience, already predisposed against him, listened with undisguised skepticism and hostility. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the room whenever he mentioned aesthetic uniformity or community standards. Then Susan Miller, one of the board members who had agreed to support Barbara, took the floor. She spoke calmly but forcefully, outlining the legal and ethical arguments for reinstating the ramp. She cited the emergency exception clause that Mr. Abernathy had discovered, emphasizing the demonstrable hardship Timmy faced without the ramp. She also pointed out the potential legal liability the HOA faced if they continued to deny him access, referencing the Americans with Disabilities Act. John Davies, the other sympathetic board member, followed Susan, adding a personal appeal. He spoke about meeting Timmy, about hearing his story, about the profound impact the ramp had on his life. He challenged his fellow board members to consider the human cost of their decision, to look beyond the strict letter of the law and see the boy whose life they were affecting. Next, it was Barbara's turn to speak. She rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice clear and strong. She told the story of Timmy's accident, of his long and difficult recovery, of his unwavering spirit in the face of adversity. She described the joy he felt when the ramp was first built, the freedom it gave him, the sense of independence it restored. She then recounted the heartbreak of watching it being torn down, the tears in Timmy's eyes, the feeling of helplessness that washed over her. "This isn't about a ramp," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's about my son's life. It's about his dignity. It's about his right to live in his own home with the same ease and access as everyone else." Her words hung in the air, silencing the room. Even some of Peterson's staunchest supporters looked uncomfortable. Finally, Mr. Abernathy, the retired lawyer, delivered the coup de grace. He presented a meticulously researched legal brief, outlining the potential damages the HOA could face if Barbara decided to sue. He cited precedents, case law, and expert opinions, demonstrating that the HOA's position was not only morally reprehensible but also legally indefensible. He even had a lawyer friend who'd watched the case for free. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice booming through the room, "you have made a grave error in judgment. You have violated not only the spirit of the law but also the letter of your own bylaws. You have exposed this association to significant financial risk. And most importantly, you have caused immense pain and suffering to a young boy and his family." Peterson, visibly shaken, tried to interrupt, but Mr. Abernathy cut him off. "I urge this board," he continued, "to do the right thing. Vote to reinstate the ramp. Apologize to Mrs. Miller and Timmy. And, for the good of this community, consider removing Mr. Peterson from his position as president." The room erupted in applause. The board members, sensing the overwhelming sentiment of the residents, and fearing the legal and financial consequences of their actions, began to deliberate. The discussion was brief. The vote was swift and decisive. By a margin of 8-2, with only Peterson and one of his most loyal cronies dissenting, the board voted to approve the immediate reinstatement of Timmy's ramp. They also voted to issue a formal apology to Barbara and Timmy and to cover all costs associated with the ramp's reconstruction. But the final blow to Peterson came when a motion was put forward to remove him from his position as president. The vote was even more lopsided, 9-1. Peterson, stripped of his power and authority, humiliated and defeated, stormed out of the meeting without a word. The room erupted in cheers. Barbara, tears streaming down her face, hugged Timmy tightly. The community had spoken and justice had prevailed. The victory was sweet, not only for Barbara and Timmy but for everyone who believed in fairness, compassion, and the power of collective action. The news cameras, which had been waiting outside, captured the emotional scene, broadcasting it to the world. Creekside Manor, once known for its heartless HOA, was now being hailed as a community that stood up for what was right. The rebuilt ramp, constructed within days by a team of volunteers, became a symbol of resilience, hope, and the triumph of good over evil. It was a testament to the power of a mother's love, a community's solidarity, and the enduring spirit of a young boy who refused to be defined by his disability. The weeks following the HOA board meeting were a whirlwind of activity and positive change for Barbara and Timmy. The new ramp, built to even better specifications than the original thanks to the influx of donations and volunteer labor, was completed in record time. Local contractors, eager to be part of the feel-good story, offered their services at discounted rates or even for free. The ramp wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, with decorative railings and landscaping that seamlessly integrated it into the front yard. It was a far cry from the unsightly structure Peterson had condemned. The media attention continued, with Barbara and Timmy appearing on several local and even national news programs. Their story resonated with millions, becoming a symbol of the fight against bureaucratic overreach and the importance of accessibility for people with disabilities. Letters and emails of support poured in from around the world, and Timmy received countless gifts, including a customized high-tech wheelchair that allowed him to navigate even the most challenging terrain. Meanwhile, Harold Peterson's life took a decidedly different turn. The humiliation of his public ousting from the HOA presidency was just the beginning. The national media attention painted him as a villain, a heartless tyrant who preyed on the vulnerable. He became a pariah in Creekside Manor, shunned by his former friends and neighbors. Whispers and pointed stares followed him wherever he went. But karma, as they say, had a more direct and immediate form of retribution in store. Just 3 days after the board meeting, as Peterson was sulking in his perfectly manicured and HOA-approved garden, disaster struck. A freak microburst, a localized and intense downdraft of wind, ripped through Creekside Manor, seemingly targeting Peterson's property with laser-like precision. While surrounding houses suffered only minor damage, a few missing shingles, a toppled garden gnome, Peterson's house was hit hard. A large oak tree, weakened by years of Peterson's obsessive trimming to ensure it met HOA height regulations, crashed down directly onto his roof, causing extensive structural damage. The impact also shattered his prized collection of antique porcelain figurines, meticulously arranged in a display case that, ironically, had been the subject of a previous HOA dispute. To add insult to injury, the torrential rain that followed the microburst flooded Peterson's basement, ruining his meticulously organized collection of HOA meeting minutes and bylaws, dating back decades. The irony was lost on no one. The man who had lived and breathed by the rules, who had enforced them with an iron fist, had been undone by an act of nature that seemed almost divinely orchestrated. Peterson was forced to move out of his house while extensive repairs were undertaken. He had to hire contractors, navigate insurance claims, and most humiliatingly seek temporary housing in a nearby apartment complex that, he discovered to his horror, had a far less restrictive HOA. He was now subject to the very lax standards he had so vehemently opposed. The final and perhaps most satisfying twist came a few weeks later. Peterson, desperate to recoup some of his losses, decided to sue the HOA, claiming that their negligence in maintaining the trees on common property had led to the damage to his house. He hired a lawyer, a young, ambitious attorney fresh out of law school, eager to make a name for himself. However, the HOA, now under the leadership of Susan Miller, the board member who had championed Barbara and Timmy's cause, was prepared. They had Mr. Abernathy, the retired lawyer, on their side, and he was more than happy to take on Peterson one last time. Mr. Abernathy presented a masterful defense, arguing that Peterson, as the former president of the HOA, was ultimately responsible for the association's tree maintenance policies. He pointed out that Peterson had consistently prioritized aesthetics over safety, insisting on excessive trimming that had, in fact, weakened the tree that fell on his house. The judge, clearly amused by the irony of the situation, ruled in favor of the HOA. Peterson's lawsuit was dismissed, and he was ordered to pay the HOA's legal fees. He was left not only with a severely damaged house and a mountain of debt but also with the enduring reputation of being the man who sued his own HOA and lost. Barbara and Timmy meanwhile thrived. Timmy, empowered by his newfound freedom and the outpouring of support, became an advocate for disability rights. He started a blog, sharing his experiences and raising awareness about accessibility issues. He even gave a speech at a local school, inspiring other children with disabilities to pursue their dreams. Barbara, freed from the constant stress and anxiety of battling the HOA, found herself with more time to focus on Timmy and on her own well-being. She started taking evening classes, pursuing a long-deferred dream of becoming a nurse. The GoFundMe donations, far exceeding their initial needs, were used to create a scholarship fund for other children with disabilities in Creekside Manor. The community of Creekside Manor itself underwent a transformation. The Ramps for Timmy movement had brought people together, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose. The HOA bylaws were revised, with a greater emphasis on inclusivity and compassion. Peterson's reign of terror was over, replaced by a more humane and understanding approach to community governance. Years later, the story of Timmy's ramp and Peterson's downfall became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for what's right. The ramp itself remained, a lasting symbol of resilience, community spirit, and the enduring power of karma. And Barbara, looking at Timmy, now a confident and independent young man, knew that even the darkest of times could lead to a brighter future, a future where kindness and empathy always triumphed over cruelty and indifference. The whole situation had made her a local hero, and while she hated the spotlight, she was proud of what she and her son archived. It was worth it. Phew, what a story. If you loved that roller coaster of justice and community spirit, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got plenty more incredible stories lined up, and you won't want to miss a single one. Subscribe now and join the family.